Hello, welcome. My name is Katie Cannon. I'm the Curator of Education at the DAR Museum. Now, if you're not familiar with what the DAR is, it stands for Daughters of the American Revolution, and members are all women who can trace their ancestry back to someone who assisted the cause of the American Revolution. The DAR founded the museum as a way to further its goals of historic preservation and education. So the museum collects objects from American houses from mostly the 1700s and 1800s. That's the historic preservation part. And then the education part is the different exhibits and programs that we do, including this one. So today we're going to take a look at some of the objects in the museum's collection that were made by women. Let's get started here. We're going to start with women making art. Now, women, especially in the middle and upper classes, were encouraged to learn artistic skills, and some became professional artists. So, for example, the sisters Sarah and Anna Peel in 1824 became the first female members of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. We have objects in our collection from some of their relatives. Their cousin Rembrandt Peel painted the painting on the left, a pretty famous one of George Washington. And then we have several objects in the collection from their father, James Peel. Sadly, we don't have any of their work in our collection, so today we're going to focus on a lesser-known artist's work. Give her a little time in the sun. So this is a watercolor painting by Mariette Darney, and it's small. It's only about 8 inches high, and this type of miniature painting was affordable in the 1800s, even to those who were not part of elite society. So it could be a pretty lucrative business for the artist as well, with a pretty wide customer base. This one she painted in 1846, and it is a watercolor on painting. She was working in Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana. Now, this little girl was likely Creole. So let's look at that a little bit. Louisiana's Creole culture. I want to clarify the terminology a little bit. Creole can refer to the language. It's a hybrid language formed of French and West African elements. And then it can also refer to people. So that actually has a more complicated past. The way it's used now often assumes a black or mixed race ancestry, but that has not always been the case. So here's what happened. So before the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Creole meant anyone native born in Louisiana. So it distinguished between people born in that area, no matter what their race or social status, versus those who moved to the area, whether from Europe, usually France, or other parts of the Americas. And then between the Louisiana Purchase and the Civil War, so a period of about 60 years, the term mostly applied specifically to white persons born in Louisiana. What happened was this. Once this became part of the United States, shortly after their enslaved persons could no longer be brought into the territory, and so they no longer needed the term to distinguish between native-born and foreign-born persons of color, so they gradually dropped it. Then after the Civil War, it flipped. The black community revived usage of the word, while white Creoles gradually abandoned the term. They didn't want to be associated with persons of African heritage in the era of Jim Crow laws when people of color faced persistent discrimination. So the word is a lot more varied than it usually gets credit for. This is a great collage put together by Laura Plantation showing people who are Creole. Usually people who considered themselves Creole throughout Louisiana history were connected more by the culture of the area than by race. So they spoke French or Creole, the language. They were often Roman Catholic as well, in contrast to the areas of the United States where the predominant language was English and the predominant religion, Protestant Christianity. So with that in mind, knowing the background of this little girl's heritage, let's look back at her portrait. So she's dressed very fashionably for the era in a short dress and cute little pantaloons. And her hair has a center part, which is a clue when you were looking at images of young children from this time. If you were to look at portraits of young children from the 1800s, you would come to the conclusion that there were no boys, because all young children wore dresses until they were about 6 or 7. So you have to look at other clues. In the modern day, we use colors, pink and blue, although that is actually pretty recent. That's only been established in the last maybe 100 years. So they use different signals at the time, like what they're holding. She's got a basket and a parasol. That's a clue that it's a girl. If she were a boy, it would be maybe a book or a toy. Also, I mentioned her hair is parted in the center. That is a hairstyle for girls at this time, whereas boys parted theirs to one side. So shall we put that to the test? Here's another portrait from our collection showing 4 children in the same family. And so with what I just told you, can you tell which of them are girls? Most people can figure out that C, as in cat, she's a girl, yes. And she is shown here with her 3 younger brothers. So there's only one girl in this portrait. We can do a little comparison here. You can see that the color doesn't matter. The color of their clothes is very similar. So what you look at are things like the objects they're associated with. She's got a basket and a parasol. He's got a book. It's not like 100%. Sometimes girls have books too. But their hair, where it's parted, that's another big clue. So it's not like we don't necessarily look for one, defining characteristic. It's sort of more the whole picture so that we can tell. I mean, it also helps that we know the names of all the children in this portrait. So this is the only known artwork by this artist. It means she may have been a local artist who worked for nearby clients, maybe of a more middling class. And unfortunately, we don't know that much else about her. But we can certainly still admire her work. All right, for our next section, women making textiles. We had a lot to choose from for this section. Women made a lot of textiles at this time. So I just picked one. It was hard, but here it is. This is a counterpane. That's like a quilt, but there's no stuffing. It's just the front and the back. And it was made in 1864 by Margaret Dodge. She was in her 80s by that point. And the reason she made it was for a sanitary fair. So let's talk about those for a bit. So during the American Civil War, medical and sanitary conditions for soldiers were pretty dismal. To fill that need, the federal government authorized a private organization, the United States Sanitary Commission, which worked to provide medical and sanitation supplies to soldiers. It was led by men, as you can see here, but there were many local branches that were segregated by sex, and the women's branch fundraising efforts, I have to say, were rather more successful than the men's branches. And this is because women organized sanitary fairs. These were large events held in several major cities, and they were long and complicated. The first one lasted for 2 weeks and raised $80,000, and that's in the 1860s. So here you can see the outside and inside of one of the buildings in the Philadelphia Sanitary Fair. So you can get a sense of the scale of these things. They were organized entirely by women, much to the dismay of the commission's male leaders who were leery of female autonomy. Now, if you went to a sanitary fair, what would you see? Well, they featured auctions, raffles, exhibits, entertainment like music concerts and elaborate dinners. And those are the events that Margaret Dodge made this counterpane for. Probably. We're pretty sure. And the reason we think that is she made an identical one out of silk that they exhibited at the Brooklyn Sanitary Fair, and that one was described in newspapers. So we know for sure that she did that one, and then she made at least 2 others, identical ones out of cotton. We have one in our collection, there's one in another collection. So we don't know the current whereabouts of the silk one, unfortunately, but we do have her identical cotton item. She apparently was just cranking these things out for this cause. And so this counterpane is an example of women using their skills to make something that takes part in a huge national event, like the American Civil War. All right, women making goods for sale. Ooh, I like this part. I mean, I like all of it, but this is maybe my favorite one. So, if you were to look at a list of trades in early America, this is not a complete list. And by early America, I mean the 1700s and early 1800s. I like to pose the question of how many of these trades were practiced by women. And the answer, as you may have guessed by this point, is all of them. And again, more than what was listed here. They did not practice these trades as often as men did, that is true, but they still did take up these trades, and we have records of it. Written, pictorial, and in the objects themselves that the women made and signed. So here's just a few images from the 1700s. These particular ones were published in France, showing women at work in the trades. Now, not all tradespeople commonly signed or put marks on their work, so some can be harder to trace than others. One trade where makers' marks were common was silversmithing. This image is from an 18th century engraving showing a silversmith's workshop, and one of the figures is indeed a woman. Now, our collection includes objects from at least 2 female silversmiths in the 18th century. This is a mote spoon, M-O-T-E. Now, this is for when you're drinking tea. At the time, this was before tea bags, so they brewed loose leaf tea just directly in the teapot. And so occasionally you'd pour your tea and a stray tea leaf would end up in your cup. Well, you can use this mote spoon. It's very delicate. It's only 5 inches long. You can use this to fish stray tea leaves out of your cup. But that's not all. It has another feature. That pointed tip, that's for unclogging your teapot spout when it gets too full of tea leaves. Very useful little article to have when you're drinking tea. And this one was made by Elizabeth Tookey. This is her maker's mark on the back, E.T., not the extraterrestrial. We don't know a whole lot about Elizabeth Tookey, except that she lived in London, and after her husband's death, she continued practicing the silversmith trade under her own name. Some of her work ended up in Thomas Jefferson's household when he married the young widow Martha Skelton. Some of the goods that Martha brought from her first marriage included a set of tablespoons that Elizabeth Tookey made in the 1760s. Now we know a lot more about this next silversmith. She's one of my favorites. This is a berry spoon. Pretty large, actually. The bowl alone is about 3 inches long. So this was made in 1786 out of silver with a gold wash, and the maker was Hester Bateman. Here's her maker's mark, and so we do know more about her. She was born in England in 1709 and married a silversmith, John Bateman. After they'd been married for about 30 years, he died. Now, the custom at the time was that if a tradesman's widow had lived with him for at least 7 years, she was accepted as a craftswoman in her own right, sort of an apprenticeship by marriage. It might have been a formality that enabled the widow to control the business, but it also acknowledged what we know often happened, which is that the wife worked alongside the husband and could be just as skilled. Hester registered her maker's mark a year after her husband's death, and then her career spanned 3 decades until she retired at the age of 81. Now, during that time, she built a workshop that turned out way more silver pieces than one person could possibly make. She had employees. They included an apprentice, her 4 adult sons, and her youngest son's wife, Anne, who also came from a silversmith family. Hester excelled at making domestic items for the middle and upper classes, like these we have in our collection. And she kept up with the times, starting with the ornate Baroque designs that were in fashion at the start of her career, like that ladle on the right, and then transitioning to the simpler neoclassical designs as time went on and styles changed. Now, both Hester and Elizabeth were from England. There were female silversmiths in early America. We just don't happen to have any of their objects in our collection. But I did pull a newspaper clipping so you can see one. Jane Inch in Maryland posted this in her local newspaper. It is announcing that, alas, her husband has died, but never fear, customers, she is going to continue on the business as usual. And actually, if you read it, it's more than just a silversmithing business. She's also running a tavern and boats to go up and down the bay. So she's running quite the operation there. All right, so rather like the textile section, there were a lot to choose from for this part. The DAR Museum's collection contains many books from female authors in the 1800s, and so it was tough to choose just one, but here it is. This is the Narrative of Sojourner Truth. This copy printed in 1875. Now, Sojourner could not read or write herself, so in 1850 she narrated her story to Olive Gilbert. Sojourner Truth then lived off the sales of this book and of her photograph. And I love the caption on this one. I sell the shadow to support the substance. Very poetic. Now, Sojourner is quite a fascinating figure. So she was born with the name Isabella in around 1800 in Ulster County, New York. And her first language was Dutch, which is the language of the Netherlands. She did learn English, but it was not her first language. Now, she ran away from slavery. She was also very tall, almost 6 feet high, quite the imposing figure. So she ran away from slavery and moved to New York City, where she worked for a preacher. Then, in 1843, she was called to become a preacher herself and renamed herself Sojourner Truth. She was about 45 at that point. Now, she gave a famous speech at a women's rights convention in Ohio in 1851. You may have heard of it as her Ain't I a Woman speech. I hate to break it to you, but she probably did not say those words. So her speech was first written down shortly after she gave it in a newspaper, and those words do not appear. However, 12 years later, a white abolitionist published an altered version. She changed Truth's words to sound as if Truth was speaking in a Southern dialect, which we know she didn't. She was from New York and spoke Dutch. The two versions are actually quite different, not just in the dialect, but also in what they say. There's similarities too, but of course the 1851 version is much closer to what Sojourner Truth actually said, since the author of the later version freely admitted that she changed both the words and the dialect. She had the intention of making a more powerful impact on her readers. I mean, I guess it worked because that's the version that most people know now. So if you want to hear something closer to what her speech actually sounded like, I'd encourage you to look up the Sojourner Truth Project. Quick internet search should bring that one up. Now, Sojourner Truth lived into her 80s, and so she was still alive when this edition of her book was published. Now, books were not the only medium in which women authors were published. This is a Christmas and New Year card. And the size, it's about, when it's folded, so it's about 4 by 6 inches. And so when it's unfolded, there's 4 sides. All 4 of them have a poem on them. And they were all written by Helen Marion Burnside. She was a British woman who was deaf. At age 13, she contracted scarlet fever, and that's how she lost her hearing. But she still succeeded in becoming an artist, needlework designer, and a prolific writer. Thousands of her verses were published on greeting cards on both sides of the Atlantic, so an American audience was very familiar with her work. So let's look a little bit about the deaf culture that she would have grown up in. Of course, deaf culture has a long and fascinating history, both in England and the United States, and I can't possibly do it justice in just a few minutes. but I pulled out a few interesting tidbits for you. So this is the first permanent school specifically for the deaf in the United States, and it was established in 1817. Now, they taught the manual method, what we call sign language, of communicating. But the American Sign Language that they were teaching here was actually different than the British Sign Language that Helen, Marion, Burnside would have known. American Sign Language is actually derived from French Sign Language, not from British. So why is that? Well, Thomas Gallaudet, who helped found that school that we mentioned, traveled to Europe to learn their methods. At the time, English schools for the deaf were not open to sharing their methods freely, so he then traveled to France, where he was welcomed to participate in the classes and learn the methods. Then when he returned to America, he brought with him a teacher, Laurent Clerc, who is the first documented deaf teacher of deaf students in America. So he taught the manual method, sign language, and then over time, other schools developed in America that taught the oral method, lip reading and speech. And yes, the painter of this portrait was indeed from the same Peel family that we talked about earlier. So let's look back at Helen Marion Burnside's poems. I'm going to read one so we can end this section with a greater appreciation of her work. New Year. We cannot guess what radiance lies beneath the shadowy veil. We can but gaze with mistful eyes while doubt and fear assail. But shade and shine must come for all, and on the very flowers we cherish most will sometimes fall the heaviest storms and showers. My love would shield thou from all ill, no cloud should on thee rest. But if it be the Father's will, my friend he knoweth best. I can but stand aside in prayer, God's ways we cannot tell, but thou art in his tender care, who doeth all things well. So on this tour, we focused on objects in the museum's collection that were made by women whose names we know. We're going to end this tour with a tribute to all the unknown women makers. Young women were regularly employed in America's earliest textile factories. The fabric they made there certainly was not signed with their names, but it's likely that the fabric of some of the objects in the museum's collection were made by women in these factories, like this cotton dress from the 1830s. If you want to know more about them, look up the Lowell Mill Girls. Also, women who were enslaved usually did not receive named credit for their work. This coverlet was made out of wool and cotton in the late 17 or early 1800s, and it came to us with the information that it had been woven by a skilled female weaver, one of the enslaved women working on an estate in Kentucky. She and many other skilled women and men made many things that enriched America's economy and material culture, but their names are lost to us because enslaved persons generally did not get credit for their work. And finally, nail making was a task not unusual for female blacksmiths on both sides of the Atlantic. It doesn't take a lot of physical strength. I can attest to this, I've done it myself. It, just takes a lot of stamina and precision. And the tradition goes back a long ways, as we can see from this English illustration of a woman making nails in the 1300s. So these nails in the DAR Museum's collection came out of a house in Maryland. They're iron nails made in the late 17 and early 1800s, and it is quite possible that some of them were made by women. Although, of course, nobody signed the nails that they made, so it's really hard to trace individual ones. But there's a chance. So as we've seen, women have always been integral to the material culture of the United States. While stereotypes would have you think that women of the past only had roles within the home, and I have a whole other tour on that, there is plenty of evidence that they actively participated in many aspects of society, especially in making things. There's no trade in America that men did that women didn't also do. So here's something to think about as you go about your day today. What objects that you use were made or invented by women? There are some great lists out there of inventions by women, and I'd encourage you to look into it. So thank you all so much for joining me on this tour of the DAR Museum. I hope you'll check out our website for more events and digital resources. And if you have any questions, you can reach us by email. That's the main inbox for the museum. And so if anything you send there, we can easily forward to whoever on staff can best assist you.